I'm a sports nut. I love all sports, hockey, soccer, But I am fascinated by those talented athletes. I mean, it is an absolute thing of beauty to see Steph Curry drain three-pointers from half court. I mean, you just sit there and go, how does he do that, right? Or to see Mahomes escape a couple of linemen, throw a perfect spiral into the end zone, or Tiger Woods draining a 75-foot putt on the 18th green. I mean, I love all those things. But one of the hardest things in sports to execute, it's a good curveball. The curveball has been around since baseball was invented. And a good curveball requires the perfect combination of strength and accuracy and finesse. Because of the spin of the ball, it'll start in one location and end up in another. And it has made men look like fools for decades. I read a story recently because I was interested in curveballs and how they work, and I've never been able to throw a good curveball. But I began to read about who had the best curveball. You know what they say. I mean, this is across the board. I didn't find anybody that disagreed with this. Sandy Koufax had the best curveball. And he was known for his curveball. I mean, it was a knee-buckling curveball. Countless hitters were made to look like fools because Sandy Koufax knew how to throw a curve. Sandy Koufax actually also knew how to throw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, too. So that's kind of handy to have. But the 1963 World Series, Sandy's curveball went up against Mickey Mantle. And Mickey Mantle was known as being a curveball hitter. In fact, the book on Mickey Mantle, do not throw him a curveball, because he's looking for it and he will crush that thing. And so at first at bat, Koufax, Mantle, eye to eye, Koufax strikes him out 3 fastballs. Boom, 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 right down the center of a plate. Mantle was a little embarrassed, and he's the greatest. I mean, Mickey Mantle, who doesn't like Mickey Mantle? Next time up, Koufax throws him 2 fastballs again, 100 mile an hour. Whiffs on both of them. It's 0-2. And Mantle is saying, this dude is not going to get me this time. I mean, everybody in the stadium is expecting what? The fastball. Because Koufax was told, don't throw him a curve. So Koufax is up there, he's getting ready to pitch, and you know how they do, right? Koufax is looking down, looking at the catcher, and he shakes him off. And the catcher's like, so the catcher throws the one, can throw him the fastball. Koufax shakes him off. The catcher catches on, gives him the 2, throw him the hook. Koufax winds up, throws him the hook. Mantle doesn't even swing. He just stands there, and it drops. It starts about chest high and ends up at Mantle's knees, right in the catcher's mitt. Mickey Mantle just stood there dumbfounded. And in fact, he turned around and he looked at the catcher and he goes, how's anybody supposed to hit that stuff? Of course, he said it with much more colorful language, right? I'm in mixed company here. I can't repeat that. But a good curveball takes years to master. And when a pitcher gets it right, it can be nothing short of magical. And batters have looked foolish year after year. My question, though, isn't really about baseball. It's more about life. What do you do when life throws you a curveball? You just stand there and watch it? Do you whiff? I mean, you think you've got a bead on the ball? You think you've got a bead on how life is going? And that sucker just breaks right down to your knees? What then? Let's look at what happens in David's life. If you have your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 24. Just catch you up to date what's going on here. Saul, at this point, full vent to his jealousy. He is full on in killing mode. He's convinced the only way that I can keep my throne is I have to kill David. And at this point, David's basically lost everything because Saul of Saul's hatred towards him. I mean, he's lost his position in the royal court. He's lost his wife. His friend and confidant Samuel is dead. And his best friend Jonathan is miles away. And because of his relationship with his dad, he can't be of any assistance here. And then on top of all of this, the king has declared that David is public enemy number one. He has nowhere to go. He's living life on the run. He even tried at one point to go and live with the Philistines, Israel's enemy. And that didn't work out. So David heads to the hill country. And by this time, 400 other men have joined David's party. These men each have their own beef with the king. They're crossways with the king as well. They don't like the way that the king is leading. And so they have left, and they're on the run as well, and they join David. And they retreat to the hills of En-Gedi. And it becomes a game of cat and mouse. Because everywhere David goes, there's some rat somewhere that goes and tells Saul where David's at. And then Saul pursues him. And then when Saul gets close, possibly that same person will come and tell David, hey, Saul's getting close, you need to run. And so David evades him. And so, I mean, this cat and mouse game goes on all over Israel until finally David's had so many close calls that he retreats to En-Gedi, because in En-Gedi the geography is just perfect. I mean, it's the high country and it's got plenty of caves for shelter. Look at verse 1, chapter 24. After Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding further back in that very cave. So here we have Saul resuming his pursuit of David after the dealing with the Philistines, and that problem popped up. He hears David's in En-Gedi, and so he gathers 3,000 quasi kind of Navy SEAL types. I mean, these are the elite troops, special forces. And it just so happens that Saul's a human being, and he has to relieve himself. You know, kings, it's kind of humiliating for a king to relieve himself in front of everybody. So he seeks a little privacy, right? He sees this cave, and he goes into this cave. And the Hebrew term that's used here is that he needed to cover his feet. That means he dropped trowel right there, you know. And so David's in that same cave. I imagine David probably didn't have access to any Febreze or a candle or anything. So, you know, we're going to have to do something about this, right? Look at verse 4. It says, now's your opportunity. David's men whispered to him, today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. Here's David's dilemma, okay? He's been on the run for nearly 4 years. And by this time, he's got almost 600 men to take care of. He's away from his family. They're away from their family. They've been living in caves in the wilderness. They're constantly on the move. He's tired. His men are tired. I mean, the question that constantly has to be entering their mind is where does this end? How does this end? And so they know that Saul is not going to stop until David's head is on a platter. And so the question for David here is, why shouldn't I strike? I mean, think about this. If I take care of this right here, right now, everybody goes home. My men are happy. They can reunite with their families, and we can actually have a shelter over our head and a hot meal tonight. It could all be over with one thrust of the spear. I mean, the man is vulnerable. There is no more a vulnerable position for a man to be in than what Saul's in right now. You know why when dogs go to the bathroom that they're always turning and looking at their owner, looking over? It's because they're in a vulnerable position. They want to make sure that their owners are watching their back. A little piece of information for you. You're welcome. Okay. But David knows that if I kill Saul, his men will scatter, my men will be happy, they'll all be good. And that's the advice that his men give him too, is you need to take care of this right now. You need to kill Saul. Just sidebar for just a second. When you're in a bad situation, when you are in bad circumstances or hard times or tempting situations, you're going to hear some advice from people who actually mean well. And that's not always a good thing, okay? I mean, the advice that David's men gave him, it was well-meaning. They wanted what was best for David. And it was spiritual. They invoked the name of the Lord. You know, surely God has brought this to you today. I mean, this is an act of God. It's not just a coincidence. And it's encouraging. I mean, if you're David, you want to hear this, right? Look what God has done for you. You're on God's good side. He's provided this. It's going to be over, quick and simple. But David knows that the advice is all wrong. I mean, this is wrong counsel. David knows that God would never sanction murder, even to accomplish the end result. And so when you're in a tight spot, you know, beware of well-intended bad counsel, because it does exist. But anyway, back to the story. As David's approaching Saul, he kind of has second thoughts here. And instead, he chooses to cut off a piece of Saul's cloak, and then he quietly shrinks back into the cave in the darkness. I mean, David is really taking a big chance here. Because if by not killing Saul, he is betting that his men won't mutiny. I mean, they could rebel. I mean, they could just say, you had your chance, we're done with you, we're out. Look at verse 5. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. David here, he feels guilty for cutting off the piece of that cloak. You know why? Because he has a right perspective on this. He knows that this is God's chosen man. And by cutting off the cloak, he said, I shouldn't have even done that. I know what God has promised. Let God provide it for me. I mean, there's a significance to this tearing of the cloak that I don't think a lot of us really put one and one together. Because if you go back to 1 Samuel 15, there's a story where Saul has done something evil, and Samuel tells Saul, I'm done with you. I can't have anything to do with you. And he tries to walk away. And Saul reaches out and grabs the hem of Samuel's cloak and he tears it. And Samuel turns around and says, just like you tore my cloak, this kingdom is going to be torn from your hands. I mean, do you see this? I mean, this is a stark reminder to Saul. Whether or not David intended to do this, meant it to be this way, it has this effect. Because when all this is coming out, surely Saul's going to immediately go back and remember, oh, I tore Samuel's cloak and he declared that the kingdom would be taken out of my hands and given to another, and now the other's here and he's torn my cloak. I mean, I don't know if it's intentional, but who knows? Killing Saul would have solved so many of their problems, though. And nobody would have ever blamed David. I mean, he could have justified it. It's self-defense. I mean, Saul's trying to kill me. He abused me. He threw a spear at me twice. Or maybe on a grander scale, David could have justified it by saying, Saul's just not a good leader. He's leading this nation into ruin. He's jeopardizing the future of God's people. He's ruining our nation. God has chosen me. He's not fit to be king. The people love me more. I'll get away with it. Nobody's going to blame me for this. But David also knew this. David also knew that you can never achieve the purposes of God by breaking the commands of God. He knows that. Look at verse 7, the last part of it. Here's what it says. After Saul had left the cave and gone on his way, David came out and shouted after him, my lord the king. And so then at this point, he just shows him the cloak and he asks him, he says, why do you listen to people who say I'm trying to harm you? You can see for your own eyes it's not true. For the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave, and some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said I'll never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one. Look, my father, at what I have in my hand, it's a piece of the hem of your robe. I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. That should prove that I'm not trying to harm you and that I have not sinned against you, even though you have been hunting for me to kill me. May the Lord judge between us. Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are trying to do to me, but I'm not going to harm you. As that old proverb says, from evil people come evil deeds. So you can be sure I'll never harm you. You understand what's going on. David waits till an opportune moment, waits for Saul to get back out of the cave and possibly cross back over the canyon back to the other side of the hill. And then David steps out and waves the cloak, and he shows him. And he says something really interesting. In verse 13, he says, as that old proverb says, from evil people come evil deeds, so that I can be sure I will never harm you. Here's what David's essentially saying. He's saying, I could have killed you just now, but if I did, I'd be as wicked as you are. And so he's basically saying, your sin doesn't justify mine. We do that, don't we? Don't we see how people have sinned against us and then we repay them, we justify it in our mind saying they sinned against me, and so we justify our own sin that way? David's saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stoop to your level. I think at that point, it became real to David that I'm just as capable of sin as he is. And if I was to kill him, I'd be no better than he is. Look at verse 14. Who is the king of Israel trying to catch anyway? And he goes on, he talks about himself and how he's just a nobody. And he says, may the Lord therefore judge which of us is right and punish the guilty one. He's my advocate and he will rescue me from your power. And then after David finished speaking, Saul called back and said, is that really you, my son David? And he began to cry. And he said to David, for you are a better man than I am, for you have repaid me good for evil. Yes, you have been amazingly kind to me today, for when the Lord put me in a place where you could have killed me, you didn't do it. Who else would let his enemy get away when he had him in his power? And may the Lord reward you for the kindness you have shown me today. And here's the key. He says, and now I realize that you are surely going to be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule. Now swear to me by the Lord that when that happens, you will not kill my family or destroy my line of descendants. So David promised this to Saul with an oath. And then Saul went home, but David and his men went back to their stronghold. Saul kind of sounds pretty remorseful here, doesn't he? I mean, he acknowledges that, he even goes to the length in saying, you're going to be king one day. He acknowledges that David's going to be king. But you notice here at the end that it makes a point to say David and his men went back to their stronghold. David doesn't return home with Saul. He stays there in the wilderness. And I think this is free, okay? This is just extra. Just because someone says they're sorry to you and you forgive them doesn't mean that things always have to go back to the way they were. Sometimes it's good to allow a period of time to elapse so that we can make sure that repentance is true and sincere. When you've been in an abusive relationship, just because he cries and he begs and he pleads doesn't mean you have to move back in and return to that old job. Or it's okay to allow a period of time just to kind of elapse. It don't mean that you have to be back and be BFFs forever now. You have an obligation as a Christian to forgive, absolutely. But you can and you should build a gap of time in there to test whether the repentance is true and real. If that person is truly sorry and they truly do love you, they'll wait for you. They'll still be there. That's free. But David thought everything was on track. And so he unexpectedly anoints Samuel to be the next king. David defeated Israel's greatest threat. He's engendered himself to the nation, and then everything falls apart. That's where we're at now. Saul's jealous. He's going to kill him. And David's lost every support he had. And God's promise that you're going to be the next king, it seems to be in jeopardy at this point. I mean, you can see that this is a key moment for David. He has two choices. His first choice, if you got your study guide and you want to follow along, first choice he could have done, I mean, answering the question, what do you do when the path you're on takes an unexpected turn for the worst? I mean, you could take matters into your own hands. You could do that. And we do that by rationalizing revenge. I mean, that's the strategy David's men were in favor of. If you don't kill him, we'll kill him. I mean, if your boss is a jerk, undermine him, steal from the company, come in late, complete shoddy work, right? That's how we rationalize that. I'll do these things to get back to him. Or if someone discriminates against you, you go and discriminate against them. I mean, you cheat on your taxes? Hey, it's okay. The government's wasteful anyway, right? We rationalize that revenge. It just feels justified when the wrong you've endured, you get a chance to pay it back a little bit, right? Or you can take some privileges. And what I mean by that is you can find ways to escape an unfair world. Life hasn't been fair to you, so you have a right to find escape from it. My life hasn't turned out like I wanted to, so I'm going to drink my pain away. Or my wife is no longer intimate in a way that I want, so I'm going to have a mistress, or I'm going to indulge in pornography, or my job's stressful, so I've earned the right to be a total butthead to everybody else. That's what we do. We take those privileges. Or sometimes we compromise and we just say, hey, God's promised me this, and He's not moving fast enough, so I'm just going to take matters in my own hands. That's kind of the thing that Abraham and Sarah did with Hagar. God had promised Abraham, you're going to be a father of many of a nation as numerous as the stars in the sky, and it wasn't happening fast enough. And so they just tried to speed the process up along, you know. And so if maybe you're single and you're just all beside yourself because God has yet to provide you a suitable mate. And so a lot of times we take matters into our own hands and we just start dating anybody and everybody, even people that you know you shouldn't be dating. Or maybe you feel like you're behind financially. So you stop tithing and start keeping that portion for yourself, hoping to kind of make up some lost ground there. That's what we do. We compromise. Sometimes we manipulate things. This is similar to the prior method, except instead of being so direct, what we do here is we strategize and we manipulate. I mean, it's God's not on my timetable, so I'm going to take things into my own hands and I'm going to start manipulating the process. I'm going to start forcing the process. I don't want to wait on God. But I refuse to take no for an answer, so you begin to leverage your friendships, or maybe you start guilting people into doing what you want. And throughout that whole process, what you'll find yourself doing is obsessing over that and manipulating everything in your path. You know, in all these things, what you're doing is you're trying to complete in your flesh what only God can do in His Spirit. Or you can do what David did. And what we see David did is he waited upon the Lord. I mean, David knew that God had chosen him to be the next king. He also knew that God had chosen Saul to be the king as well. And David knew Saul became king because of God's authority, and he will be deposed by God's authority. I'm not going to be a part of it. You see, God is the ultimate judge. He's the ultimate avenger. David, in his mind, must have been thinking, my responsibility in all this is just to obey the Lord and let the chips fall where they may. A few years ago, Joel Embiid was drafted by the Philadelphia 76ers. And during his introductory press conference, he made a statement which is very interesting. He said, I trust the process. I trust the process. And what he means by that is, I'm not going to come in here and try to force something, and I'm not going to try to come in and just be a superstar and be the hog the ball and be a one-man show. I'm going to come in and I'm going to commit to the process of becoming better, of going through practices Yeah, we're going to lose some games along the way. There's going to be some setbacks, but I'm going to trust the process. That's what David's doing. David said, I refuse to harm the king no matter how justified I feel in doing so. I'm going to wait upon the Lord, and I'm going to do things His way. Now, here's my challenge to you. I want you to apply that to your own life for just a second. I want you to apply that to your own circumstances. I mean, if you're waiting and looking for a future spouse, your attitude should be, I will wait for the Lord. Or if your career seems to be stalled, I will wait for the Lord. Or if your marriage isn't where it should be, instead of taking things in your own hands, I will wait for the Lord. If you're financially not where you want to be, I will wait for the Lord. Now, this isn't passive, sit on the couch, do nothing, and just be a potato. I mean, David is very active through this process. I mean, he's protecting himself by running. He's constantly praying about the situation. He's asking God to change it. He's confronting Saul in safety and pleading his case. He's presenting himself to Saul and saying, look, I'm not here. I'm not the one that's wanting this. I'm not trying to kill you. I could have. And so David's doing all of this from a posture of trust in the Lord. He's refusing to compromise, and he's going to trust that God will see him through, and he's going to ignore the temptation to speed up the process. I mean, David is actively watching and looking for where God is at work and moving so that he can join in. You know, the biggest enemy in your life is not those Sauls. The biggest enemy in your life is your inability to wait. You know, there was a study done by a school of medicine in New Zealand, and it was a 40-year study. Well, before I go on, do you guys ever remember, I showed a video some time ago, it's the marshmallow test. Are you familiar with that? Where they take the little children and they set them down in an empty room and they put 2 marshmallows in front of them. And they say, if you will wait 10 minutes and don't touch the marshmallows, when I come back in, I'll give you 2 more marshmallows. And then they have a video camera on the kid, and the kid gets squirmy, and he can't stand himself. And eventually they reach up and they take little bites of the marshmallow. And it's the idea of, can you be patient? Self-control. Well, this university in New Zealand, they took it to another extreme, and they did a 40-year-long research study, and they tested over 1,000 children. They started them young. They did that marshmallow test with them. And they wanted to see, and they noted which of those children exhibited the best self-control. And then out of those 1,000 children, they took all those 1,000 children and began to track them. And they followed them into adulthood. And you know what they found? They found that those children who possessed the ability to wait patiently, they experienced a greater level of success into adulthood. And they determined that one of the key factors to being a productive, successful adult is the ability to control your impulses. And you're way more likely, once you do that, to experience better health, increased wealth, improved social success, if you can just say, I will wait upon the Lord, instead of taking matters into your own hands. And in that, you know, in the life of David, we actually see the life of Jesus. I mean, don't you think there was a temptation for Jesus to kind of take matters into His own hands? Going to the cross, I mean, that temptation existed, right? You don't have to go through all of this pain. You don't have to go through all of this suffering. You know, Jesus was anointed to be the next king, and He had to wait. He was disrespected. He was persecuted. He was falsely accused of things. All of that was true. And when Jesus' enemies finally closed in around Him, He didn't fight back. He didn't take matters into His own hands. I mean, He could have. He could have called down a legion of angels and had them take Him off of that cross, but He didn't. He was patient. He rested in the knowledge that God is sovereign. And he knew that God could be trusted to make things right in His own time. He didn't fall for Satan's temptation to take a shortcut. He didn't fall for that temptation to bypass all the pain and suffering, of being tormented by the hands of His enemies. Jesus was faithful to the process. And He went to the cross and He died in our place so that we could be forgiven and restored. If Jesus isn't faithful to the process, me and you are left with no hope. And because of that should give us full confidence in Jesus. And so when you find yourself in that cave of despair, and your enemies are closing in on you, and you're frustrated and tempted to take matters in your own hands, to force the issue, to try to get out of the pain and the suffering and shorten that time, remember this. God knows your circumstances. He is well aware of what you're going through. And He has not forgotten about you. And He loves you dearly. And quite possibly He has you there for a reason. I mean, imagine just for a second. If David is immediately given the throne, how much different does his reign look? He doesn't have the experience of being in the wilderness and having to endure all of those sufferings and temptations and the enemies and trying to deal with the men that are always at his back, kill him. If David doesn't go through that, his kingship looks entirely different. God knew David needed to go through this. If he's going to be the king and lead my people through one of the most difficult times, David has to have the experience of going and living in a cave. And so if you're in a cave this morning, maybe God has you for a particular reason there. Maybe He's trying to teach you something. Maybe He's trying to teach you to be patient. Be patient and trust that God's plan for your rescue is already in the works. Let's pray.
Hi, thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more content like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure to click the little bell to be notified every time we upload a new video. You see, our goal here at Arnhart is to make biblical, God-centered teaching available for everyone, regardless if they're able to be in person with us or not. If you'd like to join us live, go over to our Facebook page at facebook.com/Arnhart Baptist Church and join us for service, Sundays at 10:45 a.m. If you'd like more information about our church, visit our website at arnhart.org. As always, we love you and hope to see you next week.